Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective. Today, I've got James with me. Thank you very much, James, for joining me. Today, we're discussing the topic of the West is next, which we'll get into a little bit in just a moment. We're going to start with the news update, as we've been doing pretty regularly throughout the war so far. Today, it's been kind of business as usual. The weekend saw a kind of flurry of activity. Unfortunately, there was some stabbings of police officers in Jerusalem in the last 24 hours, which one of the police officers has died from his wounds, unfortunately. The motivation seems to be kind of a pro-Palestine motive. There's been continued bombing coming in from Lebanon in the Galilee area, which saw the destruction of some cars, and I think some civilians have been caught up in that. And there's been some retaliatory strikes from Israel, and this results in some negotiations with the leader of Lebanon, because obviously the fear is that the whole of Lebanon is going to get dragged into this crisis. And that's something I'm really concerned about. I have some friends who live in Lebanon who are good people who aren't interested in conflict with Israel. And it's a really worrying thing for me, the possibility that they're going to get brought in. And aside from that, we've seen over the last weekend, civilians have been let out of Gaza. And, you know, something that I guess I wouldn't normally accuse myself of is maybe an Anglo-American focus, whereas countries like Thailand, for example, which you maybe wouldn't consider, have said that about 100 of their citizens have actually been caught in Gaza, some of whom have been taken hostage. And I think there's something we should appreciate, that there's a real global focus of this conflict, that countries around the world are getting brought in. So Thailand was announcing that they're kind of working their diplomatic arm to try and get these people out. And that's most of the news that we've got. So we'll move on to our main topic of the West is next. James, what do you have to say about this?
Well, as we've observed many times, we should really take people at their word. And when a person is clear and repeated and leaves no ambiguity, room for sort of a gray interpretation there, and that's what astonishes me, really. And someone says, "Let's destroy Israel, let's destroy America." And we say, well, wait a minute. Let's. Is there some grounds on which we can find, common ground, a meeting ground here, and find some compromise? No, it just seems to me when someone is taking that position, inherently, there's no grounds for negotiation, and they're telling you what their intentions are. And then when they follow up such statements with actions like October 7th, it becomes quite plain that they mean what they say. They won't be happy till Israel is gone. From the river to the sea. And anyone who says, all this talk about Israel being the occupying force, when of course Hamas has been the occupying force in Gaza, is really just playing into that and ignoring. It's a strange kind of ostrich in the, head in the sand phenomenon of evasion that's going on here. They can engage in actual warfare. They can state their ultimate goals with clarity, repeatedly, leaving no room for ambiguity, as I say, and we still don't take them at their word. We still believe that somehow it's negotiable. It is impossible to negotiate with Hamas and Hezbollah so long as they refuse to recognize Israel. It's impossible to negotiate with Iran so long as they want the destruction of the United States. I don't see any. It's not like there's a lot of gray area here. But yet we continue to go for the negotiation route. I don't have to remind you that over the last 40 years, there have been numerous terrorist incidents, both in the United States and Europe, in fact, all over the world, where jihadists have been slaughtering innocent civilians, cutting people's throats, beheading them, murdering journalists, shooting up drama Muhammad contests in Garland, Texas, you name it. Charlie Hebdo. I mean, we can go on and on. The Swedes who were recently stabbed. Obviously, the target is not just Israel. Obviously, they're going to continue the jihad into the West. It is Western decadence. It is our comparative secularism. It is, in fact, civilization as we know it that is their enemy. And I'm going to put it that bluntly. Civilization is their enemy. And so Israel is just the outpost of civilization, sort of an island of comparative civilization in a world of savage tribalism. Do you think their savage tribalism will end when they destroy that little outpost of comparative Western civilization? No. They will continue on the march, and until we address it directly. And in my mind, that of course means the United States has to confront the Islamic Republic of Iran. We've had to do that for more than 40 years, in my view, and we have failed to do so. And that has meant more and more blood spilled. The chief inspiration and funder of Islamic terrorism has been Iran. More than that, it's psychological. You know, we on our side say, well, there's a difference between Shiite and Sunni, and we have to recognize, well, Iran is funding both Hamas and Hezbollah, which are on different sides of that very religious divide. We have to stop looking at it in terms of the distinctions that really make no difference, that absolutely make no difference. We have to get to the fundamental, and we have to get to it psychologically. They have to know that we're willing to take them on. And I think it is, people think it's an intractable problem, unsolvable. I utterly disagree. Once we try a genuine war, once we try to truly, genuinely, psychologically break the enemy here, I think that it'll be easier, much easier, than World War II. Much easier. These people are living in the Dark Ages. They're not as sophisticated as the enemies that the Allies faced in World War II, for example. We can psychologically break them. We can convince them that there's no way for them to win. Look at the power imbalance in Israel. Israel could, if it wanted to, do a genocide tomorrow, wipe out Gaza's population like that. So when they say genocide, occupation, obviously it's, it's the very turning of the language, projection. It's turning of the language upside down, so you miss what's actually going on. Similarly, this is not an intractable problem. These people believe that Allah rules the universe, and if they lose, Allah is telling them, you're the loser, back off. And all we have to do is deliver them the word of Allah with some convincing more than language, and I'm pretty convinced that they would back off. Why don't we give it a try?
Yeah, I completely agree with you about the kind of allusion you made to ostrich behavior, keep sticking your head in the sand. And it's confusing to me, I guess, in the sense that I don't think people, for the most part, ignored the nature of ISIS, for example, a few years ago. Some people did, in the sense that, they would say, so-called Islamic State, as if they were ignoring that Islam was obviously a key motivator for these people. But for the most part, people understood these are evil people who are the enemies of civilization, and they need to be fought. And that wasn't contentious. They might, people might try to undermine Western efforts in methods and in certain things like that. But at least I don't remember there being this kind of deliberate obfuscation of the nature of what ISIS was. It would have seemed, I think, too obvious to people what ISIS was. And yet Hamas, there seems to be people who don't recognize that, kind of like you said, this is a species of the same thing. There was a great phrase that Christopher Hitchens coined, which I think he was taking from Hannah Arendt, which has got some currency now, which is fascism with an Islamic face. And if you understand, and that is kind of getting at the idea, there's a fundamental kind of nationalistic, religious authoritarianism underneath these people. And that's completely opposed to the values of Western nations. And if it were to come to pass that they were to defeat Israel, which I don't think they're going to do, and I don't think is really possible. I think Israel's too strong, even with all the guilt that's put upon them. I don't think it's going to come to pass. But let's imagine that were the case. It's only a few years ago, in the UK, for example, that we had weekly terrorist attacks in London in 2015, 16, 17, in France, and so on. And I remember what that felt like. I would have been 17 or 18, and it's a scary feeling. And that's just a sliver of what's been going on in Israel for a long time. And I remember how scary that was. And the idea that Hamas wouldn't be in favor of that, or the people who were perpetrating these attacks or supporting them secretly behind the scenes in the UK wouldn't be in favor of kind of Hamas helping these kind of things happen in the UK. It's just deluded. And the scary thing is seeing all the support that's coming out, not only from deluded students in Western campuses. Here in Edinburgh, there's marches almost daily, chanting, from the river to the sea and so on and so forth. But it's really terrifying. And in London, especially as well. And I guess it's something we really have to consider, that the enemies of Western civilization is not only from Western academics who aren't from Muslim civilizations, but that the Muslim kind of threat to Western civilization is very large as well. And I don't want to, I'm sure there are people there are people born Muslim who feel very affronted by hearing that kind of sentiment, and they kind of feel like, why are you putting it on me? But we can't ignore the fact that there are many Muslim groups out there who would like to impose a theocratic, fascistic style authoritarianism on the West. And the fact that Western people who supposedly kind of subscribe to vague kind of Western values, who would broadly be in favor of free speech, of individualism or something, even if they're not very consistent with it. The fact that those people are deliberately ignoring the nature of Hamas and of the enemy out there is just shocking. Do you have any thoughts why people are doing that, James? What do you view as the motivator for it?
Well, they're not thinking. They're not identifying. When someone states a contradiction flatly like that, then obviously they're confused in their own head. They haven't cleared up their own head. If you, for example, when 9/11 happened more than 20 years ago now, thousands of civilians were slaughtered in New York City, thousands, in a suicide jihadist attack. Obviously, it was religiously motivated by the nature of it. You could see that it's Islamicist. And what happens? Hamas and Hezbollah are partying in the street. The PLO, mind you, is partying in the street. There's partying in the streets of the West Bank. These people are allied. These people are connected. It's all part of the same thing. All you have to do is abstract, take the common features here, form our concept, form a generalization here, and it's not that difficult. It is the refusal to form that generalization. Islamicism, connecting it with Islam, finding the cultural, philosophical connections all the way back to the religion of Islam is a dangerous thing, because then you see we're at war. What did George W. Bush, the president of the United States after 9/11, say? Islam is a religion of peace. We're not at war with Islam, because the idea of Western civilization being at war with Islam as such was just unthinkable. My gosh, the whole Islamic world we have to take on? No. You don't have to, as you were pointing out, there are plenty of Muslims. They're not the dominant force, though. There are plenty of Muslims. I know them. I'm related by marriage. It's a very astonishing thing. I am personally related by marriage to both Muslims and Jews because I live in the United States, where they're really, we're aiming for just exactly that kind of melting pot. And my family very much reflects that kind of melting pot. I know perfectly well that there are Muslims who want to live in peace and don't want to kill all Jews on sight and bring down Western civilization. Unfortunately, they're not the dominant force in the Islamic world today. The dominant force in the Islamic world, and all you have to do is look at the effect of this attack on Muslim countries. From Micronesia to Morocco, what was their reaction? If they can't say, no, wait a minute, obviously, well, we're Muslim, but Hamas went way too far, that was horrible. They can't do that. If they can't do that, then that tells you about the culture generally in the Islamic world today. And the culture generally in the Islamic world today is exactly what needs the psychological break. As I say, physically, materially, these people are not really the challenge for the West that the Nazis were, the communists were, by any means, or the Imperial Japanese were, by any means. On the other hand, we're afraid to take on the issue. We're afraid to name the concept for all its parameters because we're afraid of what that might imply. But that is, I'm afraid, the dimension of the problem. Not wanting to state the dimension of the problem does not make the problem go away or reduce its dimensions. It's just the ostrich's head in the sand. In fact, the more you evade, the worse the problem gets, the more you encourage. It's been appeasement. It's been appeasement that's gotten us here. And so the more moderate forces, say in Iran, a place which has a comparatively moderate secular sector of the population, they're intimidated. They're pushed back. When they try to rise up, do they get any help from America or the West? No. And so what we've done is only encourage the very worst elements in the Middle East. And our appeasement just continues to do so. And so anyone who's better in the Middle East, any better voices among Muslims, are intimidated, silenced, cornered, made irrelevant.
Yeah. Just for super chats, we've got 99 cents from Bonnie. Thank you again, Bonnie. You've been giving every day that I've been on the show recently. So thanks for the continued support. Yeah. And the nature of the problem is, I think it becomes existential, and people on the channel have been mentioning a lot. And I think Harry Binswanger went through them kind of at length recently. The Hamas founding documents, and for some reason, I think that if this were put on the front, if the Hamas founding documents were put on the front page of every Western newspaper for a day, part of me feels like you could no longer ignore the problem. And yet, in a sense, the whole problem is that even if it were that blatant, people would be ignoring the problem. But let's not forget, people, that in the Hamas founding documents, it explicitly calls for every Muslim in the world. It's every Muslim's duty to go out and jihad, struggle for the removal of Jews from the Holy Land. That no Muslim should be able to rest until that's done. And it explicitly rejects a peaceful negotiation. So people who we were discussing on the channel the other day, Razi and I, a British journalist called Owen Jones, who said all he wants is to stop the slaughter, and that that's all he wants. He doesn't want to spot Hamas. What Hamas has done is terrible, but he just wants the stopping of killing of civilians. Well, there can be no peaceful solution at the behest of Hamas, and we can't forget that. So the people who are saying all they want is peace, it's either sticking your head in the sand or it's open malice. Really, there's no way you can get around it. And unfortunately, we see our politicians kind of give abeyance to this by talking about either a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause, which is just, I guess, a short-term ceasefire. It's just the same thing, really. And it's really awful seeing this kind of existential threat to the West going on, because if we can't recognize our enemy in the plain light of day, who is saying, "I am your enemy, I will destroy you," then what are we going to do?
What do they need to do or say before it convinces, before it sinks into in the minds of the ordinary Brit or the ordinary American? It just hasn't sunk in the same way. I think for Israelis, obviously, it's a very different thing. They're used to the rockets that have been coming now, year after year after year, thousands of rockets nonstop. They're living with the issue. But it would seem to me that even just the terrorism that we've had experienced in the West should have been enough to sort of get the attention of Western intellectuals and Western politicians, and the ordinary guy on the streets of London or New York should be clued in to what the real threat is here. But I think part of it is, if we don't name it for what it is, we don't have to face it. And that's exactly it. They don't want to name the concept. That would, in fact, look, conceptual clarity here would be enough, I should think, would be enough to sort of dictate, at least we can argue about the parameters of what kind of a response there would be, but the general moral position about the response would be clear, wouldn't it? We have to do something has to be, steps must be taken. Now the only debate is what steps are appropriate to take. Whereas currently we're not even there yet. We're not even at the place where we have any kind of moral clarity where we can say, no, Islamic, oh gosh, I miss Hitch. You said it. Islamic fascism is a reality. And until we have that kind of clarity, we're not going to have was there any question, as Adolf Hitler is invading Poland and then invading France, is there any question who the bad guy was? And it was that moral clarity that gave the West the ability to look, yes, civilians are going to die. Yeah, we're going to have to wipe out Dresden and Berlin. In fact, we're going to have to wipe out Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But it was your doing. It was your doing. And the only way we're going to solve this problem is get to the root of it and pull it out by the roots. And unless that happens, the moral clarity that is a precondition for a decent response is simply not there.
Yeah. Connecting to that, there was an interesting debate at the Oxford Union a few days ago, which, if anyone doesn't know what it is, the Oxford Union is a great historic kind of debating hall in Oxford University that's kind of hosted great debates throughout the centuries, and is a kind of free speech hub. Supposedly, they kind of wobbled on that in recent years, but historically, that's what it's been. And they invited Ben Shapiro to come give a talk, and naturally, he was questioned a lot by the students about the Israel and Palestine conflict for the most part. And what was interesting about it is, I think you could be easily forgiven for thinking that the students were just ignorant of the history of the conflict, and they were. So, for example, one student stood up and said to him that Israel is at fault because if they were giving a just response, only an exactly proportionate amount of Palestinians would be killed as Israelis. which is a bizarre perspective. And we're talking about proportionality on the reality show next, so people want to hear about that, we'll talk about that. But which is bizarre. And then she said, and they wouldn't be killing civilians. And Ben Shapiro interrupted her and said, you know, you're presumably in favor of Britain having fought the Germans in World War II, and would you have condemned Britain for having killed German civilians? And she said, but Britain didn't kill German civilians. And as to which the whole hall kind of booed all at once. And Ben Shapiro said, well, ask the people in Dresden, except you can't because they were firebombed to death. And
Yeah.
And like the ignorance of an Oxford student who are meant to be the creme de la creme, smartest people, not only in the UK, in the world, to blank that out. And so on the one hand, I think you could see that and you could think, oh, these are just ignorant, dumb kids. And there's a way in which that's true. But that deliberate, so if you go watch that, people, and you listen to it, she kind of trips over herself and she kind of knows that's not true as she's saying it, but she just has to say it. I think there's a deliberate, like we were talking about, a deliberate desire to stick her head in the sand, to say something which is farcically ridiculous, that the Allies and the British especially didn't bomb civilians in World War II, which just go read a history book. Like we did, very much so. And also she probably considers herself left-wing. It's a big kind of article of faith on the left that the bombing of Dresden was a bad thing. You know, it's something that gets talked about a lot. So go look at how young people are talking about this and how they have to obfuscate the fact at hand, the facts of history. You know, so there is some confusion, I think, about these things, but often I think there's a kind of...
I think it's a sort of idealism that is completely religious on the left. And it's funny, it's among even people who would regard themselves as secular leftists, there's a sort of mystical moral idealism that pacifism is somehow morally good. People will point to Gandhi or point to Martin Luther King Jr., and they will say, look at the passive resistance and how turning the other cheek and lying down in front of the evil oppressors was the most effective response. As if Gandhi was not playing to the British press, as if Martin Luther King Jr. did not have the American press that he could play to. Imagine their strategies against a Hitler. Imagine their strategies against a Stalin. It wouldn't have worked. Hitler would have simply taken Gandhi to a gas chamber, and that's the last you would have heard of the Mahatma. Similarly, if Stalin had Martin Luther King, he would have taken him out much, much earlier than it was. After the first time he made a headline, Stalin would have sent Martin Luther King Jr. to a gulag, and that's the last anyone would have heard of him. And similarly here with these Islamicists, if we really think in our mushy-headed Western attitudes, all we have to do is offer peace, and these people, who wouldn't? These people don't really mean what they're saying. All we have to do is offer the right kind of peace, turn the cheek the right way, submit the right way, let them beat us up for a little while to get it out of their system, and then it'll all be behind us. No. These people war is real, and war is not a game. And if you're not if you can't win the debate by appealing to the British populace via the London media, or if you can't appeal to the American populace via the American media like Gandhi and Martin Luther King did, that kind of strategy is counterproductive. In fact, it's surrender. It's total surrender. War is hell, to quote a famous American general. And in order to do it properly, you have to recognize that it is hell. You have to recognize that the aggression is forcing you to use deadly force yourself. And if someone is holding up an innocent in front of them as a shield, to withhold the force that we need in self-defense is only to kill more babies. They're killing their own innocents. They're using, and in this case, it couldn't be more, in any case of an aggressor, it's that way. But in this case, it's particularly clear that the headquarters is under the biggest hospital in Gaza. Hamas headquarters is under the biggest hospital in Gaza. These people are intentionally killing their own people for sheer numbers. Now, in the West's muddle-headed idealism of what war could and should be, they don't even factor in evil of that caliber. And the only way to fight evil of that caliber is with decisive force.
Yeah. You raise a couple of issues in my mind, and this relates to a couple of things that I'm going to pitch to Razi that we should do on the channel in the next few weeks. one of which is the idea of kind of a history of just war theory, because the thing that's remarkable to me about this is looking at the history of the West and how we've engaged in wars, and how in history we've always been Christian, we've always had an altruistic ethic, and yet we haven't always engaged in war in this manner. We've never been so guilt-ridden as compared to any other time in our history. So why is it that we're most like this now? And people I speak to say it's just war theory. I think we should have a little, like, an in-depth look at that. But also, you were talking about kind of airstrikes, and I think we need to do a kind of update to Leonard Peikoff's "A Picture Is Not an Argument," and how people are posting the videos of airstrikes on Twitter and saying, look, there's all these dead children. And I've seen those, and I've seen pictures from history of people who've been killed in war, and there's a way in which I think maybe the removal in time doesn't affect you quite as much. But see, and I've seen the video of mangled children, of blood on the floor, of burnt bodies. It's true, it's awful. I've never felt quite as bad as seeing that. It was like being there. But it doesn't change the argument. It doesn't change the facts at hand that Hamas started this and that Hamas is responsible for that. And so I think we need to talk a bit, and we can go over Leonard Peikoff's "The Picture Is Not an Argument."
The picture of the dead baby is horrible. Any decent human being is going to be horrified and disgusted and revolted. And of course, the picture doesn't tell us who caused the death of the baby or how to prevent more baby deaths. That is a conceptual identification. That is a purely conceptual idea. If Hamas would allow the civilians just to leave an area, which they won't. If Egypt would allow people to flee Gaza, which they won't. I mean, foreign nationals are getting out now, I understand, and more humanitarian aid is coming in. But the point, though, is that obviously Israel is not engaged in a genocide. Obviously, Hamas is using their own civilians. So it's strange that we would use the pictures of dead Palestinian babies as something against Israel. So, no. You, Hamas, you killed those Palestinian babies. That's what has to be the conceptual identification for those pictures every time they run. Otherwise, we're encouraging more baby killing. Now, you can look at the picture of the baby and say how horrifying. Then my conceptual faculty kicks in and thinks, oh, what about future babies? That's what we have to do. We have to connect the dots conceptually so that we can say, see this picture, this horrible, shocking, terrible, awful thing. Well, you want more of that? That's what Hamas is all about. That is what Hamas is causing. That is what Hamas is making inevitable. That is the only solution, really.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And the broader topic we were starting with, that the West is next. One of the things we're going to be talking about in the reality show is the fact that that Biden has sent in a nuclear submarine to the region to act as a deterrent. And I think we need to take really seriously that if we abandon Israel, if the moral guilt being placed on Western leaders and so on and so forth, and also that's just coming self-generated by the Western leaders, were to win out and we were to let Israel fight this alone, then if somehow Israel were able to be defeated, if Iran got involved or what, this would spread.
Got a nuclear weapon?
Yeah.
Now, talk about a threat not just to Israel, but to every Western country out there, obviously. Yeah. We cannot be at the other side of a negotiation. Talk about intolerable state of negotiation. Look at the West and how it appeased a nuclear Soviet Union for decade after decade after decade. Can you imagine the appeasement that would come about if we have a nuclear-armed Iran? That's the end of civilization in the area and a direct threat to London and New York, as far as I can see.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we need to avoid that at all costs. So that's why the West is, we need to care about this. So we've got to wrap up because we've gone on a bit too long. We've got the reality show starting in a minute. I've spoiled it already for you guys. We're talking about proportionality and this nuclear submarine. So join us and we'll speak about that. And then join us again tomorrow where we'll have TDO. Tomorrow I'm going to be with Gilad and we're talking about weapons and ammunition, and we'll have the reality show as well. Thank you so much for joining me, James.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.